she was from a German Catholic family there. I am the product of a Greek immigrant and an Italian-American mother, and I grew up on Long Island. Yeah, some of you get what that means, you know. So the world I grew up in was a very loud world, a very noisy world, a very, by many people's standards outside of Long Island, pushy, obnoxious, I would say honest world, right? And that world was, that was the world that made me. This is the Bennington College days, right? Yeah, so that world even went with me when I went to Bennington College, class of '93. Hi, everybody. We can talk about cultural difference in Bennington in the late '80s and early '90s, and now later. But you know, there were enough people from that part of the world when I was there, so that like it wasn't weird. You know, there was no jarring disconnect between the way I was raised and the world I went to in college. When I went to the Midwest, pretty different. And I was like, what is wrong with these people? So this particular girlfriend, you know, we visited her family a lot. I really liked them. And the story I bring up now is a contrast of eating dinner. We went to their house for what was a normal dinner. They sat in the dining room. That was weird. Dinner was silent. Clinking, forks against plates, murmured, "It was you." Clink, clink, and I'm like, these people are nuts. When is this going to end? You know? Then Tracy came to my house for it was Thanksgiving or Christmas when all of us were together. And uncharacteristically, we were eating in the dining room. And we were yelling at each other the whole time. And at one point, I turned and looked at her, and her eyes were gigantic. And she was kind of terrified. She was like, what's wrong with you people? You know, I've kind of dialed it back a bit personally in my own life since then. But you know, that kind of contrast is often how these things appear to us and how we start to say, huh, you know, I have things in common with this person, but they're kind of different too. You know, this idea of culture being learned, it can be transmitted between people. Well, it is transmitted between people. It can be absorbed indirectly through interaction or directly taught, right? Infants start learning the minute they can tell that they're here. And my kids learned a whole lot from me, a lot of it bad, just by being around me, you know, about what was the right thing to do, you know, ultimately what it means to be human, right? Some of that stuff is just absorbed. Some of that stuff is actively taught. You know, I had to teach my kids certain things, and other things they just kind of picked up through watching us. And then there are things I have to reteach them because they picked them up by watching us. And I've got to fix it. But you know, we're not born this way. It's not genetic. It's acquired from other people. So culture is learned. This other idea is that within self-formed cultural groups, culture is shared, right? From a language perspective, at least, I think most people, you get what I'm saying, right? The words I'm saying make sense to you because we all speak English. Some of us also speak other languages. Some of us spoke other languages first, right? So, you know, the argument, of course, being that one of the ways we make sense of the world is rooted in the grammatical structures of the languages that we learned and that we communicate in. My father was always perplexing this way because he was Greek. And when I would ask him questions, he would say, "Dad, do you think in Greek?" And his answer was interesting. He was like, "Sometimes it's easier." He didn't really explain what made it easier. You know, like what kind of things were easier to think about in Greek. But, you know, culture is shared but not monolithic. It's framed by things like race, class, gender, age, region. All these things have an impact on cultural variance within communities that would identify as culturally related. The United States of America. You know, take me, Greek Italian American, teetotaling, vegetarian, secular humanist from Long Island. Rock me in rural Alabama. Stuff will make sense, but it's going to be different. I'm going to have a hard time making sense of people, and they're going to have a hard time making sense of me. you know, and we're all Americans. Drop me in the middle of Germany with someone from rural Mississippi, and you bet that person from rural Mississippi and I are going to have a heck of a lot more in common than the culture that we're surrounded in. You know, and this is one of those things that, you know, Americans abroad, even when they disagree politically, tend to glom together, right? Because we do have a shared way of making sense of the world. So, hang on. There are different rules for different contexts. You know, when is it okay to laugh? When is it okay to laugh at a funeral? Because sometimes it is, right? You know, different contexts have different rules, so there's no absolute guiding principle that says it's always okay to do this one thing. And then there are individual perspectives on stuff, no matter where we are. Right. I mean, one of the things people like to chime about is how, you know, America, you know, on a spectrum of collectivist to individualist, America is a highly individualist. You know, yes, it is. I think that's a fair assessment if you're using that as a spectrum for trying to understand how people relate to each other. But there's variance everywhere. You know, individuals take a perspective on what makes sense to them and apply it as they're able. Lastly, culture is dynamic. Culture changes in response to all sorts of things. Hang on, I gotta remind this stuff here. It'll be worse if I don't. You know, this is just a rough thing, right? Internal pressures. You know, I was thinking on the ride down here, so I collect old comic books. And for me, there's no better reference point for understanding cultural change, particularly in regard to, say, women's rights, than romance and Archie comics from the 60s and 70s. And in particular, because what you get there are middle-aged comic book male writers trying to make sense of this changes going on around them. But the contrasts are pretty enormous, you know, and deeply significant. Representative Lewis talked a lot about those changes he had seen over his life that directly resulted from the civil rights movement. So people can't affect culture. We can change it. There's an interesting contrast where two good friends of mine, who one's an ethnomusicologist and one's a folklorist, were doing research in Malawi in South Central Africa. And their research was on a bunch of things, but this one thing emerged where folks in ethnographic disciplines talk about culture as dynamic, right? As performed, as invented, as something we enact and reinterpret and redo. And they were interviewing people about essentially really crappy behavior by men in relation to their partners. And the response they kept getting was, that's the badness of our culture. You know, so we can talk about culture as dynamic. We can also think about it as an absolute thing, right? As something we're subject to. But my argument is we can change it. You know, clearly because the evidence is here over my lifetime in how we can change it. And perspectives on certain things can change. In the way, and there's other evidence too, to say the way we see the world, both generally and specifically, was not how people saw it 200 years ago. In this same place, just as the way people see the world 3,000 miles away from us is not the same as we see it here now. And you know, from the perspective of agriculture, oh wow, I got plenty of time, huh?
Yeah.
Awesome. From the perspective of agriculture, Jennifer Post, an ethnomusicologist who used to be at Middlebury, published a book called Music and Social Life in New England, 1871 to 1942, something like that. And our argument at the Folklife Center is that weird window, it seems weird, but it basically, what frames it? The Civil War on one side and World War II on the other. That was a window here in Vermont of relative cultural stability. And agriculture and subsistence agriculture was a fundamental part of that world. A world that was built on farm neighborhoods of people in proximity to each other, an affinity that grew in those. A world that was built around shared work, because that shared work was necessary to survival, and shared play. You've all heard of the kitchen junket, or kitchen tongue. A gathering that people would have periodically, because and you know, to be functionalist about it, it was part of a system of reciprocity. We work hard together, we play together, we reaffirm those relationships, we all survive. You know? And in the years following World War II, that world began to fall apart. And where we arrived, and I'm not an historian, right? So please, nor am I a farmer, is more or less in the world that's currently falling apart around us now in regard to agriculture and agricultural priorities, industrialization and increasing industrialization, you know, and crossroads, to go back to the theme, we're at that crossroads now again. What is going to be the future of agriculture in Vermont? How will that relate to the cultures of agriculture before us? And who are we going to be? You know, and how are we all going to survive? So the thing I should have said before I began was this presentation is in two parts. One part is me talking at you, and I'm kind of done talking at you. Be relieved. The other is we've got a kind of a slideshow of some photos from the collection, and I'm going to play some audio excerpts. So, as I said, we do interviews as a real deep function of what the work the Folklife Center does, and those interviews, we turn them into documentaries, we integrate them into exhibits. We also archive them, and we have an archive of about 6,000 recordings, photographs, and other stuff, so much of it having to do with agriculture. So, depending on time, I think I can do two of them. I'm going to play two selections that include audio from our archive and just an assortment of pictures. And Jake, get it going whenever, and I'll just keep rapping right now because I got to set something up over here. I mean, I don't mean rapping in the hip hop sense, the hippie sense.